There is a cost to non-intervention. There is a cost to not applying the no-fly zone. And that cost is that you may have to do more in the end. You may be facing a much more complex situation, and you may have to use significantly greater force to bring about the desired result.
At this stage, the Security Council has shown no inclination for further action on Libya. But the calls for a no-fly zone are likely to continue as long as Muammar Gaddafi remains in power. And the more Libyans who die, the harder it will be for those calls to be ignored. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, the United Nations.
Well, let's take this on a little bit. Joining me for more on the UN stance towards the crisis in Libya is Mark Goldberg. He's managing editor of UN Dispatch, which is a news and commentary website focusing on the UN. Also a senior correspondent for American Prospect magazine. Mr. Goldberg, welcome to the programme.
Thanks.
We were discussing there earlier with our correspondent, John Terrett, about this statement coming from John Kerry about this concept of a no-fly zone at least being prepared. How realistic is that? Could that fly at the UN?
Well, you know, preparing for a no-fly zone requires probably doing the heavy diplomatic lifting of convincing other members of the Security Council to get on board with this. You know, if the United States, if we're operating outside the Security Council, would likely have to go it alone to impose this theoretical no-fly zone.
That is possible, though, as John Kerry said.
It's theoretically possible. However, if they go through the Security Council, if they're able to do the hard diplomatic work of convincing perhaps reticent members of the Council, like China or Russia, to go along with this, they'll have a much broader range of support.
So effectively what you're saying is that whether or not you're preparing the way for a no-fly zone or actually trying to implement a no-fly zone, the amount of work you have to do would be exactly the same.
It's true, and it's also important to remember that a no-fly zone, as Secretary Gates said earlier this week, is more than just telling planes not to fly. It actually involves bombing a country, and the United States needs to look pretty long and hard into whether or not it wants to launch unilateral military action.
John Kerry was disagreeing with that, how complicated it would be.
I don't think he went that far in his statement. I think you can maybe interpret his call to prepare for a no-fly zone to include preparations on the diplomatic front in New York.
All right, now what about the implementation of sanctions that were approved back in February 26th, and this committee that has been set up to enforce them, I suppose, because these sanctions have already been implemented, haven't they? They are in place.
That's true. You know, what makes this Libya situation so different from so many other similar situations at the Security Council is that oftentimes you have diplomats pointing to a resolution as the culmination of diplomatic efforts, whereas really the hard work is doing the political lifting to getting these these provisions implemented. What you're seeing today is a very quick turnaround by the Security Council to form this sanctions committee, which will monitor the sanctions that were imposed.
Is it a quick turnaround? It seems quite a slow turnaround, doesn't it? I mean, they're going to talk on Tuesday about what the formation of the committee is going to be. I mean, shouldn't they be?
Well, everything's kind of relative here. What we're seeing, so far at the UN is a pretty quick response to an ongoing crisis compared to several other crises. As you said in the lead up to this program, the question of this no-fly zone over Bosnia took a year to debate. What we're seeing at the Security Council is actually a pretty quick turnaround on this issue.
And what do the sanctions mean for those oil companies, for instance, that would be working offshore? Because I understand companies like BP have pulled off their onshore workers, but the offshore workers are still there, and presumably funds are still being paid into some kind of account. Would all those accounts be shut off for access to Gaddafi and his people?
It's true. So the sanctions that were passed by the Security Council authorize an asset ban and travel freeze and asset ban on 16 members of Gaddafi's inner circle. It's unclear whether or not all of these accounts have actually been seized. You have, the international. This is part of what this monitoring group is going to do, is to take a look at how the international community has responded to that call for an asset freeze. Have they closed all the bank accounts? What bank accounts are missing?
Okay, Mark Goldberg, we appreciate that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Interesting. Okay, that's it from Washington for the time being. More a bit later. Back to you for now.
In Bahrain, pro-reform protests are continuing in the capital, Manama. Demonstrators are still camped out at Pearl Roundabout, the centre of the anti-government protests of the last 3 weeks, and thousands more are blocking the entrance to the Prime Minister's office at Gudabia Palace. Police with riot shields stood behind one gate, preventing them from disrupting a cabinet meeting. The Shia majority has long complained of discrimination and political persecution in the island kingdom. The Sunni Muslim Khalifa family rules Bahrain, which is a strategic US ally, Bahrain being home to the US Fifth Fleet. Our special correspondent joins us on the phone from Manama, not naming him for security reasons. And so it goes on. Is there a sense among the crowd of making ground, or a sense of frustration that it's lasting this long?
I think there is a sense that they're making ground insofar as the protests have been allowed to continue for at least 2 weeks now without a major intervention by the security forces. Of course, that came after the killing of 7 protesters in February, and that was followed by words of consternation from America's President Obama. Since then, King Hamad has promised to keep the security forces under tighter control, and in fact, through his son, the Crown Prince, offered to investigate exactly how those killings came about. So since then, the protesters feel emboldened because whenever they do march through the streets of Manama, they're not bothered. They're allowed to go basically where they want, which is usually to Pearl Roundabout, which has become the symbol of the pro-democracy movement. And also, they've been allowed, some of them, to camp out there. Although, interestingly, in the last few hours, I'm getting reports that the government's kind of suggesting that it might be time to question the presence of hundreds of people who are camped out at Pearl Roundabout. They haven't put out an official statement yet, but I'm hearing from my sources that they're extremely unhappy about the length of time they've been there now, David.
And what about this cabinet meeting? We saw the standoff with security personnel behind one gate, the protesters on the other, but the cabinet meeting did go ahead. Were any decisions made which might have pleased the crowd?
I don't think so. The crowd's in no mood for anything except major promises of reform. And what did come out of the meeting was a statement to the effect that the people of Bahrain do enjoy the right of free expression, and that as long as what they do is legal and within the constitution of Bahrain, there's no problem. Well, of course, the constitution of Bahrain is one of the problems that the protesters have with the system they live under. It's a system in which there is a parliament, there are elections, but real power remains in the hands of the royal family, which is why we've heard cries of chants against King Hamad and against his family on a daily basis.
Thank you very much indeed. In Yemen, at least 52 pro-democracy protesters have been hurt in clashes with government loyalists. The fighting was in Ib city, south of the capital, Sana'a. Witnesses said they heard gunfire and saw government supporters wielding batons and throwing stones. Let's talk to Hakim Al-Masmari, publisher and editor of the Yemen Post. That's an English language daily. Joins me from the capital, Sana'a. Good to have you on this news hour. I want to talk about the ruling party, those that previously have been behind the president. A number of them leaving parliament, quitting the party. I wonder if you think that's because they think the protesters are gaining ground.
They're leaving for two main